Right, so this is my talk on Blazor. It's not super techy. It's more talking about why Blazor is special and how it allows you to rethink web development. Let's start off with a short history lesson. In this day and age, there are more ways to build for the web than you can count. We have multiple approaches, languages, and stacks. Until relatively recently, the preferred approach with any kind of dynamic content was to render the front end on the back end using technologies like PHP, Classic ASP, and ASP.NET. These evolved over time and added client-side features, allowing the client to be more responsive and change data on the page live rather than forcing a reload. Enter Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. This move from exposing the UI from the back end in server languages like C# to exposing in the front end with JavaScript meant that a large number of developers had to leave their comfort zones in order to participate. It's also not hard to argue that JavaScript isn't ideal for larger projects. It suffers from a lack of type safety and thus coercion hurdles. It can behave differently in different browsers, though that's less of an issue these days where everything's Chrome, and even has fundamental issues with basic maths. It's the best programming language we have in the browser, mostly due to it being the only programming language we have in the browser, though this is why TypeScript was invented. That was true until WASM, WebAssembly, Mozilla's genius simplification of JavaScript down to the bare essentials, but amazingly optimized. The idea being that it can be used as a compile target. It's not supposed to be used by devs, but compiler tools. This enabled Microsoft and Xamarin to produce Blazor, a new take on the client, powered by a complete version of .NET running on WASM. This means your client code is any .NET supported language such as C#, allowing for enterprise standards in front-end code. You still need to follow the same pattern with the front end accessing the back end via APIs, etc. But if your back end is also C#, this allows a lot of code reuse, especially around models and the like. And this is an amazing technical achievement. It's also not that useful. At this point in time, JavaScript is the de facto standard for front end, and thus moving away from it has a huge number of downsides. That said, Blazor actually comes in two different flavors, client side and server side. Server side is where things get interesting. It's code compatible with client side, but works very differently, more like the frameworks of old. It runs entirely on the server, even the client code. The difference from the frameworks of yesteryear is how client code pushes the UI to the client. Rather than full page refreshes and the like, the server manages a local DOM and sends deltas of this DOM to the client using Signal R. This means there is almost no load on the front end. The experience is very similar to a JavaScript framework, but most interestingly, the client never sees the client code. This opens up a number of options that let you think about things differently. So where do we live? What space are we in? And why does that matter? When moving code from Blazor client-side project to a server-side project, the first thing you'll probably notice is how fast API calls are, because realistically, they aren't going across the web. Both the front end and back end are running in the same place. You have direct access to the API server. But if this is true, your front end code has the same access as the back end. You can write front end code to directly access your SQL servers, your file system, etc. You probably shouldn't, but you can. Blazor server-side lives in this beautiful middle ground between the old and the new. The fluent and responsive UI of JS frameworks, but the power and control of the old server-side frameworks. It's not perfect, but it's close, and it is constantly improving at the moment. So what does this mean? Let's think about front-end paradigms that are new and interesting from a single-page app point of view. Secret's a secret. Private keys can be consumed in the front end and yet remain private. If it's on the server, it's in the front end. The file system, other machines on the LAN, ports behind the firewall, the lot. It is all accessible. You can control the performance. While you're running every user's front end, and thus it is a heavier load, you get to define the resources. You don't need to worry if an end user has enough CPU to render your massive list in a reasonable time. The user's browser is just a thin client. And it's possible to share between sessions and clients. Caching becomes almost irrelevant when you can have data in a static global. Do I really want that sort of thing in client code? Probably not. That said, if it was okay and secure, in things like ASP.NET Web Forms, then it is still okay. Firstly, the front end doesn't need an API anymore, but you probably still do. Often the API is consumed by more than the website. That alone is a reason to not just tear out the API and put all the code in the front end. But you don't really want to manage two different versions of the same code. If you've been a responsible developer and your API controllers are very thin via a service, or even better, by using the mediator pattern with something like mediator, you've got a great option. Simply call the same code that the API would. This alone can give your app a massive boost. No HTTP requests are required, translation to and from JSON aren't required, and generally it's a thinner path. Once this is in place, you've got some decisions to make. API controllers and methods which are entirely there to service the front end, can they be removed? The smaller the footprint of an API, the smaller the attack vector. Once you're in this land of having a service that provides more than the API, things get even more interesting. Your functions no longer need to be serializable, nor do they need to be of a reasonable size. Let's look at an example. You've got an online store. You have a fetch products method that can now return images as images, just as a field within the model, if that makes sense. You can fetch the entire product catalog in one single fetch if you need to. Something static like this can be, well, a static. If user A has already viewed the store, then that data is available. The view can still be paginated if that gives a better user experience, but you get the ability to very quickly use link queries, resort the data, apply filters, etc., all at lightning speed, because there's no API call and there's not even a database hit. If you want to get very tricksy, then there are some amazing options open. Let's say this store has a list of recently purchased items. Usually this would either be set on a schedule, once on page load, or polled. With everything in the same domain, this could be completely event-driven. It doesn't even need to be tied to the database. Now, if you're like me, this all sounds very whizzy. That said, it's not quite as simple as that. Everything in the previous section can be true, everything being in the same domain on the same server. But this assumes only one server. If you have a larger site, there's a good chance that you're using a scale-out pattern, spinning up new servers when load requires, and maybe even spinning down servers at times of zero traffic. That means while sessions can share static variables, not every session can share the same session variable. With the last example we gave, the list of purchased items, this means if user A is on server 1 and buys something, then user B who's on server 2 will not receive the event. In some scenarios, this is acceptable, but many it's not. There are workarounds for this. Azure Web Apps, for instance, has a local folder that it's actually shared across all instances, and this could be watched for changes. Even if you have to resort to polling the database, this can be done at the server level rather than the session level. This sort of thing goes a long way to offsetting the extra load of hosting. If you have 500 users spread across 5 servers, what would have been 500 API calls before, which likely would have been cached to some extent, you now just have 5 DB calls, 1 per server. More fundamental concern, though, is browsers without JavaScript and networks that don't support SignalR. In both of those scenarios, Blazor ServerSide just won't work. Beyond reducing what you expose to the wider world, Blazor ServerSide flips a security problem on its head when compared to JS frameworks. As we all know, any code within JS is public. It's run on the client, so must be sent to the client. This means if you have no ability to hide. Private keys aren't private, so just aren't an option. Obviously, this is already a solved problem, but in the Blazor world, client code is private, and private keys are private. How does this help? Well, you need the client to go hit Twitter with your dev API key. That's totally fine. Generally, it makes security somewhat more brainless. It's so difficult for secrets to leak, you almost don't need to consider it. You still should. With the back-end JS front-end paradigm, you are forced to have a minimal level of separation between your UI and your business logic. When dealing with Blazor server-side, this is no longer enforced. If you so desire, you can have all of your business logic, all of your database access, and all of your remote API calls directly in your UI layer. You shouldn't, but you can. Because of this, developers do need to be more responsible. Blazor ServerSide requires you to think about your website from two different angles. And these are not new angles, but never before did you really have to consider them at the same time. Overall, you think about your front end the same way that you think about a webforms project or even an API, while still considering the front end. Blazor's front end is very opinionated about how you do things, but with that comes very simple code for doing crazy dynamic things. This, coupled with the power of being server-side, gives you some amazing options if you spend a bit more time thinking about how to architect things. So, time to get a little meta. So, this talk obviously is quite theoretical, but in an attempt to give some examples, I've built a Blazor app that uses these theories and events and such. And you're looking at it. Oh, come on. There we go. This presentation is a Blazor server-side app. You are viewing the slides in Edge, and I'm using Chrome on another desktop to control the slides and read the script. Completely separate session, driven entirely by shared variables and events. Some of the examples and screenshots I've shown have been screenshots of this very app. And if this was running on a real server and not my desktop with the limited firewall, I could even be running that slide controller that you briefly saw there on my phone on a completely different network, maybe even on 3G. So what next? There are a number of resources I can recommend. Firstly, is a fantastic YouTube series to get you up and running with Blazor. Secondly, is the Discord server for Blazor, which is amazing, and I'm not biased at all since I set it up. And lastly is Chris Sainty's blog. Chris Sainty is the closest thing the Blazor world has to a John Skeet. If you have a problem, you could scourge Google for the answer, or you could just skip the middleman and go directly to his blog. I'll also tidy up the code for this project and share it on GitHub. Code for it right now is a bit of a mess as it was done in a hurry, but it's a simple tool where you can share slides and control what slides others are looking at without screen sharing. It's actually quite a useful tool in this remote world. I honestly believe in Blazor, and both iterations are a great fit for Redgate. And honestly, in a lot of scenarios, possibly a better fit than React. All I ask is when you look at Blazor, don't think of it as a C# transpiler. It's so much more than that. And you can solve tricky problems in ways that you may not have considered before. If there's enough interest in Blazor, maybe a Slack channel would make sense. There's plenty to play with. For instance, one of my 10% Fridays, I ported a few of the Honeycomb components to Blazor components. Either way, feel free to Slack me or hunt me down on Discord out of hours. I'm very passionate about Blazor, and talking shop out of work is certainly no hardship. So thanks for coming along and listening to this talk. I do want to give a shout out to Julia and Dan who gave me a hand with this, but especially Sammy who encouraged me to actually make this talk as a Blazor app. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Round of applause for James. And I think an extra round of applause for being incredibly brave to run his entire presentation as an application. So I think that was incredibly brave. I don't know whether I would have done that, but well done, it worked. Okay, does anyone have any questions for James? We've got have quite a bit of time.
I must admit, I've got one. I like the whole idea of Blazor. I think it's a great thing, but my biggest concern is there's an awful lot of bloat. You know, how have you sort of viewed as Blazor got better with its removing all the extra .NET bloat that's still included?
With server-side, that's kind of irrelevant because you're not running a JavaScript version of C#. You are just running the .NET framework. With the client side, it needs work. It's not ready yet, in my opinion, client side. It is as fantastic, clever technology, but they need to work out a way of slimming down that rigid. Oh, I can't even say that word.
Sorry, yeah, I should have caveated that with the client side version, because yeah, the server side one I've played with a little bit, but the client side is the one I'm probably more passionately interested in.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thanks, Stephen. Any other questions?
Yeah. Hey, James, that was awesome. Thanks. What do you use to code the front end then? Like, is it? Just tell me it's not WPF.
No, it's Razor. So if bear with me, I will show you the god awful code I have here. Bear with me.
Hey, it's not awful. It's fit for purpose.
Isn't that our team slogan?
Shut up, here.
There you go. So it's just standard Razor from
All right.
ASP.NET. Nothing particularly clever about it. Stuff that most people know already.
So it is just HTML. Well, it's essentially HTML. So you can
HTML with embedded C#.
Yeah. So I guess you can package CSS with it as well, right? In
Yeah.
the usual sort of. So better for all intents and purposes, it sort of looks from the front end. It looks a bit like building a Razor front end.
Oh, it is a Razor front end. There's almost no difference to it.
All right. Okay. Cool. That's interesting. Thanks.
The sort of server-side performance scalability characteristics, like if it's effectively holding a copy of the DOM on the server side?
It definitely does perform worse than obviously shifting everything over to the clients. My experience is if you build the site without thinking about it, then you definitely notice the impact. Whereas if you build the site and think about ways to share stuff across sessions, the benefits you get from that often outweigh the extra load of the server-side rendering.
Awesome, thank you.
So James, you've mentioned a few times about the security that Blazor would bring. I didn't quite get it. How would it be safer to keep a private key in the browser? Is that right?
On server side, the code that's running and rendering everything never hits the browser. It stays on your server and only the DOM gets sent to the client. So they don't see any of the code running any of the UI.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, we have a question on the chat from Matt. In production, will there be a problem with WebSocket reconnects and load balancers?
My experience, no, I've not run anything too massive. The bigger issue I've had with corporate firewalls that break SignalR. That's probably the biggest concern right now. It's not everywhere, but it definitely does exist, and possibly in the sorts of places where we'd want people to be able to get to.
Cool.
So coming back to the question that about security, you said that on server side, the secret won't be stored on the client. What about the client side Blazor? Is there any thought on that? Or
the client side is just a SignalR DOM receiver and DOM sender. There is no other code that runs in the front end on the actual client, because the client, what we're used to seeing in the client, actually runs on our server, and we only send that DOM to them. So they don't see any executable code in any way, shape or form. They only see what's on the screen.
So James, is there still a place for using some JavaScript to do client-side stuff whilst using Blazor server-side for most of it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of ways to do that. That's actually something that Microsoft very much foresaw. things like popping up alert boxes, simple things like that, you just can't do, obviously, with purely the DOM. And there's some like local file access. So there is very much a vision for using some JavaScript. But you don't need to obviously do most of your business logic in that. You create it as sort of like a function that your business logic can call at any time, and it will fire on the client's machine. And that's one way. One way I've used that is for local storage, so I can store stuff on the client's browser's storage, a bit like a cookie.
Thanks.
Okay, any last questions? No, cool. Okay, well, thank you very much, James. That was a really interesting talk, even for a non-developer like myself. But to everyone else, thank you very much for attending this morning, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.